Hello, everybody. I see we've got quite a few people already signed in. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give everyone a few more minutes before we get started to make sure that nobody misses any of the fun stuff at the start. And actually, we backloaded all the fun stuff. I'm going to start it. So. As you can tell, those of you who are familiar with our offices, I'm actually at our office here on Lake Union. It's an unusual occurrence. We're mainly working from home, but because of spotty Wi-Fi conditions, I opted to come into the office. So we're going to have a work day at the office today. Unusual for me since March, of course. I think this is the 5th time I've been in the office. Okay, we're still getting quite a few people signing up here as we go, so we'll give it still another couple of minutes. I should let you know that I'll mention it again to others as well, but if you have any questions, comments, then please feel free to use the chat button at the bottom of the screen or in the organizer section. Feel free to click on that chat and add any statements you'd like, anything you'd like us to address. All right, well, we've got a solid 40 people in the audience. Always happy to see so many join us. So we may as well get started and everybody finish up their lunch hour. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. It is great to see so many familiar names on the list of attendees. I appreciate you being here. My name is Ryan Bixby. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a registered geologist and a managing principal here at Sounder Strategies. I'm joined on this presentation by Travis Sandy, who's an associate scientist here at Sounder Strategies, and by Jen Moore, who's a managing principal at EHSI. EHSI is a subsidiary of Sounder Strategies as of the last couple of years. I'm going to start off giving my portion of the presentation, and then we're going to transition into Travis and then Jen. This webinar is intended to provide you with some historical information about the commercial and the industrial development of Seattle and how these developments have resulted in fairly predictable environmental impacts in various areas of the city. If during the presentation you have any questions, please click on the chat button and type them in. We'll try to take some time at the end of the presentation to address any questions you may have. Sounder and EHSI perform a wide variety of environmental consulting services, including subsurface investigations and remediation projects, stormwater projects, industrial hygiene, a lot of litigation support, sediments, you name it. A large percentage of the work that we do is done in support of property transactions, and those often start with phase 1 environmental site assessments. Now, phase 1s involve researching the history of a property and surrounding properties to see whether there may be environmental issues that wouldn't be apparent just by looking at its current use. So some of these are depicted on this figure here, but we look at government databases, old aerial photos, historical maps, and archived tax assessor records going back to the 1800s to see whether the retail strip mall or apartment building that our client may be interested in purchasing used to be occupied by a gas station, or whether it was a landfill, or if the current building used to have heating oil tanks, or if it's underlain by a plume of solvents from a nearby dry cleaner. Now, as indicated on this slide, which shows the various projects that Sound Earth has performed in Seattle, we've performed thousands of phase ones, and the historical information gathered in the course of those investigations has provided us with a great understanding of how the industrial and commercial uses in Seattle and the greater Puget Sound region since the mid-1800s have resulted in environmental impacts. Obviously, not all properties in Seattle are contaminated, but this presentation is intended to provide you with that 30,000-foot view of the types of contaminants our clients should be prepared to encounter when they're considering purchase of a property in a particular area of the city. Unlike many areas, the Puget Sound region is geographically confined by the presence of lakes, mountains, and the sound itself, which limits the amount of developable land. And so if a contaminated property in an area like, say, Denver is available, it is easier to bypass that property and find something else that's close by because they don't have the geographic constraints. But in Seattle, we find that those geographic constraints result in a lot of redevelopment of properties, and most of the commercial and the industrial properties in the city have been historically used for at least one or more purpose, one or more of which may have resulted in environmental impacts. Although the Puget Sound region has been occupied for thousands of years, its industrial and commercial development and associated environmental impacts didn't begin until after the arrival of the Denny Party in 1851, for those history buffs out there. The Denny Party originally established a settlement at Alki in West Seattle and immediately began logging the vast forest resources as the first industrial activity in Seattle. However, the tides and the other factors caused them to move from Alki across Elliott Bay to the Belltown area of Seattle, which is the area that's depicted in this picture. Now, ironically, Denny himself was apparently injured when the move was scheduled from Alki to Belltown, so he wasn't able to make the initial trip, and as such, the others in the party were able to stake out their claims on land first, leaving Denny with only the undesirable portion of South Lake Union to settle himself. The irony. Now, by the late 1800s, Seattle had become a booming city, supplying timber and other natural resources to the West Coast. Approximately 40,000 people lived in Seattle around the turn of the century, and it was centered in what is now Pioneer Square area of downtown, basically the red area shown on this slide. Now, on June 6, 1889, a fire started in the north end of town. And as a result of the fact that the buildings were largely constructed of wood, were densely packed together, and were often occupied by flammable liquor stores, the fire quickly started to spread southward with the wind. Now, the photo that you're about to see was taken, this photo here was taken the day before the fire, and it shows the Occidental Hotel, which is formerly located in the Pioneer Square area. The numbers that we show here are for reference on the next slide. So the next slide, this photo, was taken shortly after the fire from roughly the same location as the previous photo. And we can toggle back and forth between them to show you the extent of the damage. It shows a small portion of the damage that the fire did, including the complete destruction of the Occidental Hotel. That hotel was eventually redeveloped into by another hotel, actually, and that hotel was again destroyed by fire. Eventually, that property became redeveloped as what you know as the sinking ship parking lot, and that architectural disaster prompted the creation of the Pioneer Square Historical District and the preservation of the historical buildings throughout Pioneer Square. In total, the fire destroyed buildings throughout roughly 100 acres or 30 square blocks of downtown Seattle, the area shown in red here. It would have extended even further to the south, but at that time, the land south of Pioneer Square was occupied by tideland, so there wasn't anything to burn. Now, the fire did cause an estimated $20 million of damage in 1889 currency, but the long-term financial and environmental impacts of the fire are still being felt. It's because the burning of wood and other products in the fire resulted in the production of what are called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, which are a long-lasting contaminant that remains at elevated concentrations in soil within the area of the Great Seattle Fire, as well as in areas where the demolition debris and soil from the area of the fire were used as fill material. The impacts associated with the Great Seattle Fire are a great example of why it's important to hire local consulting firms with an understanding of the local issues that face our region. Unlike petroleum hydrocarbons and dry cleaning solvents, PAHs, like the kind that were created by the Smelter fire, don't exhibit a strong odor typically and don't always result in staining or other obvious signs of contamination. This slide here shows a soil core that was collected from the Pioneer Square area. The reddish section is brick construction debris, and the dark brown section shows soil with charcoal and some other debris. And although this core didn't show any obvious signs of contamination, we encountered more than 20 feet of this fill material and discovered that it mostly consisted of soil containing elevated concentrations of PAHs. Fortunately, we were able to advise our client, who was intending on purchasing and redeveloping this property with several stories of below-ground parking, that the soil they would be excavating would require disposal at a permitted landfill and for higher cost. So they were able to account for those higher costs, roughly $2 million of incremental costs in their purchase and sale agreement. So if you're considering purchasing and developing a property in the downtown core, or a property that's received fill material generated from within the area of the Salem fire, you really need to be aware of this potential issue. And unfortunately, that issue doesn't show up on government databases or other local resources. Many of you are familiar with Gasworks Park, which was located directly across, or which is located directly across Lake Union from Sounders' offices. However, you may not be aware that the Gasworks Park was not the first coal gasification plant in Seattle. In the early 1900s, the first gasworks operated at Jackson and 5th Street, which is approximately where the Union train station is, currently located by Century Link Field, although now I understand we will no longer be calling it Century Link Field as of this evening. The plant converted coal that was mined from local resources into gas that was used primarily for lighting, but also later used for cooking and for heating. And the process of coal gasification resulted in a tremendous amount of petroleum waste beneath the Jackson Street gasworks. And Smelter is now in the fortunate or unfortunate position of trying to remediate on behalf of one of our clients who purchased that property several years ago. In 1906, Seattle started operating a new coal gasification plant at the north end of Lake Union, thereby taking it out of the heavily residential and commercial area that the Jackson Street gasworks had been. Now that property, which is located right behind me at the moment, is called Gasworks Park, and the plant operated on roughly a 20-acre parcel from 1906 to 1956, when the city converted its furnaces to burn natural gas. As shown on this slide, coal was brought to the site and stored in concrete pads before it was loaded onto the conveyor belt and passed through the plant, where a combination of heat, pressure, and moisture were used to extract the lighter fractions of coal gas from the coal. That coal gas was then transported through more than 1,000 miles of piping to clients in Seattle, Renton, Kent, and Tukwila. And while this process produced a very valuable resource in the form of coal gas, the heavier petroleum fractions that were left behind in the refining process resulted in widespread impacts to soil, groundwater, surface water, and of course the sediments of Lake Union. Now, by 1956, operations at the plant had ceased, and after much debate, the city decided to convert the property to a park in 1976 and made the controversial decision to retain much of the infrastructure of the plant in the park's design. In the early 2000s, they placed approximately 2 feet of soil over the property to limit the direct contact with contamination in the subsurface. And then in 2013, they realized that the thickness of the soil was woefully inadequate, and so they put on several more feet of soil in places to act as a more effective barrier to direct contact. And the remediation of that site is still ongoing and being done under an agreed order with the Department of Ecology. But there are impacts that have been encountered on adjoining properties, including one to the west of the park, where Sounders helped clean up on behalf of one of our clients that bought that property several years ago and effectively put Sounders on the map. Significant impacts are also present within the sediments of Lake Union, as I mentioned earlier, and there are plans to remediate that. And in the meantime, there are signs posted all over the park warning people not to fish or come in contact with the sediments. That is my portion of the presentation. I'm going to transfer it over to Travis Zandy now, who's going to talk about some of the other developer issues that may be faced. Thanks, Travis.
Thank you, Ryan. As Ryan mentioned, my name is Travis Zandy. I am an associate scientist with Sounder Strategies. I've worked here since approximately 2011. after getting my master's degree in history. And now I can use that degree to show you some of the history of this wonderful city. I'll be discussing development and land changes in the SODO and Lower Duwamish Waterway areas of Seattle. Ryan already touched on the Denny party arriving in Seattle. This survey map from 1879 shows the conditions of the land shortly after their arrival, when the southern portion of what is now the city of Seattle was occupied by mud flats at the mouth of the Duwamish River. The Jackson Street gas works that Ryan discussed will in the future be located where it is marked on the map. They're on the right-hand side of the picture. Yes, right there, along the historic shoreline. This 1882 photograph shows some of the development in early Seattle and the mud flats, which covered what is now SODO. By 1890, a train trestle was constructed along the northern portion of the mud flats, connecting downtown to grain terminals in West Seattle. Eugene Semple, the 5th territorial governor, passed a law allowing private companies to make land and then sell the land that they made. This would inspire a wave of land modification in Seattle, which included regrading several of the large hills which surrounded the original downtown core. In 1895, under direction of D.H. Thompson, the city engineer for Seattle, a plan was developed to fill the tidelands and build a canal through Beacon Hill to Lake Washington. The location of this canal is, as you can see on this map. If you're wondering where that canal is, it was never actually finished, but approximately 300 feet of the canal was cut before the project was shut down in 1912. This photograph from 1901 shows a sluice trestle carrying soil from the cut land into the tidelands. Note on the right-hand side of this photograph, the original Rainier Brewery on the right. This building is still standing and is a historic landmark immediately adjacent to Interstate 5, known by people driving in and out of the city by the giant neon R on one of the outbuildings. During this process, native soil was mixed with impacted soil and was then deposited directly into the tidelands. Soil from the canal digging and from several of the regrading projects across the city was used to create what is now SODO. The fill material also included construction debris, fire debris, as Ryan discussed, industrial waste, and even just some raw trash. Yesler is a street along the top of this Sanborn fire insurance map from 1905. The original shoreline is visible in yellow along the right edge of the map. Everything to the west of that yellow line is filled land. Approximately 2,000 acres were created in the SODO area, and an additional 350 acres were created on Harbor Island, which is entirely produced by fill material. It is currently also home to EHSI, as seen by the star on the bottom of that map. Developments in SODO included the first gas station in Seattle, formerly located at the bulk fuel facility located at Holgate and Western. You can see the gas station on the left-hand side of the picture, boxed in red. Note also the bulk fuel storage tanks on the right-hand side of that photograph. The first large building constructed on the tidelands was the Sears and Roebuck building, constructed in 1918. As you can see in this photograph, during filling of the tidelands, typically the roads were constructed first, and then additional material, including just barges of trash, were subsequently dumped to create additional filled areas in between. This building still stands. You may notice it after having a few modifications. Thanks to our friends at Starbucks. Any developer interested in purchasing a property in SODO should be aware that the area is entirely underlain by fill material. Unregulated fill material may contain legacy contaminants from its original use, while also potentially creating geotechnical issues to redevelopment. Contaminants of concern related to unregulated fill include metals, petroleum products, PAHs, polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, and volatile organic compounds, VOCs or solvents. To the south and west of SODO is the Lower Duwamish Waterway, or LDW for short, a man-made feature designed for industrial use. The LDW has been home to several industrial tenants over the years. As a result of the long-term contamination related to those tenants, as well as discharges from stormwater and city-owned combined sewer overflows. The LDW is currently undergoing cleanup under the federal Superfund program. The primary constituents of concern in the waterway are PCBs, arsenic, PAHs, and dioxins and furans. Of course, the industrial uses of properties along the LDW have also impacted uplands with several additional chemicals of concern. At the time of Seattle's founding, as seen in this USGS topographic map, the Duwamish River wound a meandering path to mudflats at the end of Elliott Bay. As we discussed earlier, land was added to create Harbor Island at the mouth of the Duwamish River, seen here in this photograph, in this map. The city of Seattle then set to work on straightening the path of the river in order to develop a new industrial waterway. By 1918, the bends of the river were mostly filled and a new channel was dug. Early activities included sawmills, lumber yards, wood treatment facilities, cement and brick companies, steel mills and foundries, and marine construction. This is the earliest aerial photograph of the area, which shows the LDW shortly after it was built. On the north end is Harbor Island. The northwestern portion of the new waterway was formed Kellogg Island, which still remains vacant today. On the south end is one of the most significant industrial sites built along the LDW, Boeing Plant No. 1. Here's a close-up view of the facility. It was originally constructed in 1917. It quickly expanded and became the centerpiece of industrial activity along the LDW. As Boeing expanded, so did their impacts to the land and the adjoining waterway. Constituents of concern related to the Boeing site include PCBs, petroleum products, benzene, lead, and vinyl chloride. The industrial use of the LDW accelerated with the onset of World War II. New industries included drum recycling and chemical production. Here is a photograph of a chemical manufacturing facility from the 1950s. On the left-hand side of the bottom left-hand corner of the picture, you can see a number of above ground chemical storage tanks right there that were located on the property. This facility is a source for dioxins, furans, and pentachlorophenol, or PCP, a common wood preserving chemical manufactured here. These constituents have impacted soil, groundwater, and sediments in the adjoining embayment. Several manufacturing and metal fabrication facilities also sprung up along the banks of the LDW. Constituents of concern included petroleum products, metals, PCBs, and VOCs. Another common facility on the LDW was cement manufacturing. One of the byproducts of the cement manufacturing product is a material called cement kiln dust. It's a very fine dust that is a byproduct of the firing of the cement material inside the kilns. It was widely distributed along the LDW and adjoining areas as fill material. It has excellent properties regarding fill material, but it also has a very high alkalinity and contains elevated concentrations of metals, including arsenic, lead, and chromium. The CKD may also have additional impacts related to contamination from materials used in the firing process, whether it was petroleum from the fuel, the oil used, or leftover PCBs if, say, waste oil was used as a firing mechanism. Here's a figure from a 2015 ecology report showing the known and suspected areas of cement kiln dust along the LDW and surrounding areas. Whether your property is on one of these places or nearby, it's good to know that CKD may be an issue if filling occurred on your property during, say, the 1940s, 50s, or 60s. Another common industry located along the LDW was wood treatment. Lumber yards and sawmills are the most common areas of wood treatment. However, even small facilities can have a big impact. Take this small shop located in this tax record photograph. This is a shed occupied by the Mineralized Cell Wood Preserving Company in the 1930s. We discovered that they would use an arsenic solution, which would be suspended in that bucket in that A-frame material on the left-hand side of the photograph. The arsenic solution would then be drained out of that barrel into green logs stored behind the shed. the arsenic solution would be injected into the logs due to the force of gravity, and any excess arsenic solution would then be discharged directly to the clearly unpaved ground. Here's a close-up view of the logs located next to the sheds. As you might expect, this property now has significant arsenic impacts in both soil and groundwater. The LDW was not the only area in Seattle where wood preserving took place. The lumber industry was a huge economic boost to the area in the years after the original founding. Ballard, formerly known as the shingle capital of the world, was historically home to several sawmills. This image shows several of the sawmills which were historically located along Salmon Bay. Many of those sawmills are underlain by fill material comprised of sawdust and wood debris. Potential impacts include elevated concentrations of metals, petroleum products, solvents, PCP, PAHs. This is one of the primary sources causing region-wide impacts throughout the Ballard Interbay North End Manufacturing and Industrial Center, which you may know as BINMIC for short. That brings me to the end of my presentation. So now I'll turn it over to Jen Moore with EHSI. Hello, Jen.
Thank you very much, Travis. I am Jen Moore. I'm a managing principal at EHSI. Today, I'm going to talk to you about historical activities and impacts in the South Lake Union area, about the Tacoma and Everett smelters outside of the Seattle area, and about some things that may try to sneak up on you in the near future. Just to get everybody oriented a little bit here, this is a map of Lake Union. Up here we have Gasworks Park, which Ryan spoke about earlier. This is the Queen Anne neighborhood. This is the South Lake Union neighborhood. This is the Western Mill Company, which is one of the first major industrial facilities in the South Lake Union area. And this is the future home of Sound Earth Strategies. Here are two photos facing southeast and southwest from the lake. They show horse-drawn carts bringing fill material in to dump into the lake. The fill material includes municipal garbage, construction debris, foundry slag, logs, sawdust, and various other materials. Common contaminants include petroleum hydrocarbons, PCBs, chlorinated solvents, wood treatment chemicals, and metals. The sawdust present in the subsurface causes both geotechnical and environmental issues. Degradation of the sawdust can dramatically lower the pH of groundwater and surface water that it comes into contact with, and it can cause misleading diesel range organics detections that aren't from petroleum sources. This can be a challenging topic to address with the Department of Ecology because they don't like to let us use acid silica gel cleanup to get rid of those mysterious DRO detections. Disposal of some of this material has been known to cause redevelopment costs to increase by hundreds of thousands of dollars. So make sure you do substantial due diligence prior to purchasing a property in this neighborhood. This is a photo of the Western Mill Company. Again, one of the largest businesses in the SLU. It was built at the southern tip of the lake in 1882. One fun note about this photo is this is the Queen Anne neighborhood over here. It looks a little bit different than it does today. This is the very beginning of its development. This photo, a number of years later, shows how the Western Mill Company expanded north into the lake. And you can see that there's been quite a construction boom over on Queen Anne. It still isn't fully built out, but it's quite a bit different than it was in that initial photo. So here's a USGS map from about a little over 100 years ago, showing a still relatively undeveloped Lake Union area. South Lake Union's being built out a little bit up around Gasworks, but you can see that much of the rest of the lake is still rather undeveloped and natural. This is a more recent USGS map showing substantial redevelopment around the lake. These neighborhoods are all filled out. We have the Ship Canal and the Mount Lake Cut. Here you'll see an old coal-fired power plant that was visible in the photos of the fill material being placed in the lake. There were large areas of coal storage in the SLU neighborhood that were associated with this power plant, but they weren't contiguous to the power plant. So you will find pH contamination in some areas that are in no way immediately adjacent to this plant. The Ford Motor plant, pictured at the lower right, was built in the same area just before the Great Depression and didn't operate for an extended period of time because of that. The building now is occupied by a public storage company, but it's still there. There have been a large number of auto repair and fueling facilities in the SLU area. They caused widespread contamination across the SLU, including a former ConocoPhillips site at the corner of Westlake and Mercer, which released 80,000 gallons of gasoline. Sources of contamination associated with these facilities include leaking USTs, leaking dispensers, leaking piping, surface spills, including overfilling of the USTs, and leaks associated with hydraulic leaks. This is a map of the Westlake-Mercer ConocoPhillips site, where once again 80,000 gallons of gasoline leaked from a piping elbow at the southwest corner of the property. That leak created an explosive atmosphere in the surrounding sewer lines, which was very exciting for some public workers. Contamination existed in all 4 rights-of-way from the ConocoPhillips station and a historical filling station that was at the northwest corner. Contamination also likely extended across Mercer to the property to the south. The site's been remediated in several phases. Phase 1 was an excavation in the right-of-way of Westlake Avenue North, this red box here. Phase 2 involved excavation of soil across almost the entire property to 16 feet below ground, which is this green box. A slurry wall was installed around the perimeter of the excavation prior to the beginning of excavation activities. Remediation systems that existed in Westlake Avenue North to the east and Terry Avenue North to the west were decommissioned prior to implementation of Phase 2. Phase 3 was reinstallation of ASSV remediation systems around the perimeter of the block. So Terry, Mercer, Westlake, and Valley all have remediation systems. This green is the last remaining remnants of the slurry wall. At last check, they're still actually dealing with a few lingering issues at the site that the groundwater is starting to clean up. Auto stations are bad enough, but dry cleaners can cause much more challenging problems. They can cause contamination that's much more difficult to assess and remediate. Petroleum compounds are a lot more straightforward. They are lighter than water, so that means they leach through the soil until they hit the groundwater table, and they float there and slowly move in the direction the groundwater table flows. Chlorinated solvents are more dense than water, so they continue sinking when they reach the groundwater table. Chlorinated solvents will still migrate in the direction of groundwater flow, but they'll not be found right at the surface of the groundwater table, so you have to play seek and destroy when you're going after chlorinated solvents. Another challenge is that some of the daughter products associated with chlorinated solvents, such as TCE and vinyl chloride, are actually more harmful than the parent product. Petroleum hydrocarbons and chlorinated solvents are very volatile and can cause vapor intrusion issues in buildings. Chlorinated solvent cleanup levels for indoor air are very low, so those can actually be difficult to achieve. This is a map showing a lot of sites in the South Lake Union area. Automotive facilities appear as the red dots. This is our buddy, the ConocoPhillips site right here. The blue dots are dry cleaners. The green and orange dots are other industrial properties. So if you have a site in the South Lake Union area, ecology is likely going to push you into an agreed order instead of letting you join the VCP. And that's because there's so many sites here that they can be somewhat interconnected. If you're using a dewatering system in areas like the SLU, your system can draw contamination from a neighboring plume into its wells. This can not only pull the contaminant plume away from its remedy, but it can also cause your project to require treatment prior to discharge. Now, dewatering water in Seattle goes into the stormwater system, which flows to the nearest surface water. So that's going to be up here at Lake Union in this neighborhood. This requires a permit with the city of Seattle. The permit requires testing and usually treatment of the wastewater to meet surface water criteria prior to discharge. The surface water criteria are very low, so the treatment can be costly. The moral of the story here is, once again, conduct thorough due diligence before purchasing a property in the SLU. So now we're going to take a visit to a couple of other places outside of Seattle. That's going to be the Tacoma Smelter Plume and the Everett Smelter Plume. Both of these smelters cause widespread arsenic and lead contamination associated with particles that fell out of the emissions from their stacks. Additionally, these smelters cause localized acid rain due to the high levels of sulfur dioxide being emitted. In the past, the Tacoma Smelter actually had a gentleman they would send around to neighborhoods after it rained to pay the property owners cash for the plants that were damaged. Here's a map showing the areas where the Tacoma Smelter Plume can be found in soil. The most highly contaminated areas are in Tacoma, Ruston, and down by Joint Base Lewis McChord, and up on Vashon and Maury Islands. Here are a couple of fun historical photos of the Everett Smelter showing what that operation looks like. Looks like good times there. Everett Smelter Plume is divided up into the upland areas, which are primarily residential, and the lowland area, which is primarily commercial and industrial. Assessments of properties in Tacoma and Everett Smelter plume areas is more prescriptive and has to follow specific guidance from ecology and EPA. It's not like your typical straightforward site characterization. First, you have to divide the property up into logical decision units based on specific area, on the use of specific areas and where the contamination is likely to be present. Then you use a sampling program called multi-incremental sampling, where you assess each decision unit with borings that have multiple samples collected from different depth intervals. You average the data for each depth in the decision unit to determine the thickness of the soil layer that needs to be excavated and disposed, or the thickness of clean fill that has to be brought in to cover the contaminated soil. This is similar to methods that are used at outdoor shooting ranges. So what's coming? So far, we've primarily talked about historical contamination, some of which was in place prior to environmental regulation. What's coming down the road that you should be aware of now? One answer in our minds is PFAS. So what are PFAS? PFAS are chemicals used in the production of nonstick surfaces, water and stain repellents, waxes, and aqueous firefighting foam. PFAS can leach into groundwater and run off into surface water from landfills, spills, and areas where aqueous firefighting foam has been applied. PFAS can get into your body through contaminated drinking water, food you consume from Teflon pans, nonstick food packaging, sunscreen, a lot of chemicals you use in your home and in your garage. The list just goes on. So why are they dangerous? They can cause low birth weight, immune system malfunction, different forms of cancer, thyroid disruption, and can affect your liver and kidneys. Also, the carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest and shortest bonds in nature. So it's really difficult to break. It's so difficult to break that it actually takes a really, really long time to break down in the environment. And it's actually very hard for us to remediate at this point. So where do you find PFAS? You can find PFAS anywhere that aqueous firefighting foam has been applied, including fire training areas, airports, and on military bases. It can be found at the manufacturing facilities where the chemicals were created, and that includes 3M and DuPont facilities that are mostly back east. It can leach out of landfills because we've disposed of a great deal of PFAS-coated municipal waste. It can be found at electroplating facilities. And should you look for PFAS during due diligence? Yes, you absolutely should. We're writing regulations for these chemicals right now. So hire somebody that knows the difficulties of testing for these chemicals and get out ahead of it. So in summary, we don't actually want to discourage you from developing here. We actually like it here ourselves, but we do want to help educate you and help you protect yourself. Thank you very much. Our contact information is up at the top. Our next webinar next month will be protecting your employees during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are now open for your questions.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Travis. We've actually just got one question that's submitted, and we have some other questions that others have sent in. The first question we got was, the question is, what rough percentage of phase ones in the Seattle area results in recognized environmental conditions? I think that Travis and Jen and I are all probably capable of answering that. We would probably all give a slightly different answer. So I'll start and let them disagree with me. I would say that it is more often than not that we identify recognized environmental conditions as part of the phase one environmental site assessment. I would say that maybe 75% of the properties that Sound Earth investigates end up having a recognized environmental condition. And that can be something as simple as a former residence that had a heating oil tank, or an on-property issue like a gas station or a nearby dry cleaner. I mean, those are just very tough to get away from. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that 75% of the properties are actually contaminated. It just means that about 75% of the properties have a condition that might warrant some additional investigation. Travis and Jen, do you guys have any other thoughts on how frequently you encounter wrecks?
I mean, I must admit that the number I came up with in my head was about 70 to 80%, so right in your same window. I would also point out that even on some sites where we haven't necessarily identified a wreck, such as a heating oil tank, we've been careful to inform the client that even though our records do not show the heating oil tank, in Seattle, just assume you're going to come across at least one heating oil tank, whether it's a residential property or anything larger than one parcel in a commercial area, you're probably going to find at least one heating oil tank during redevelopment. So whether it is identified as a wreck or not, that's just something that was the case in Seattle back in the original development days.
Definitely.
Yeah, I agree. About 75% is what popped into my head too. It isn't always even something that historically existed on your property that might be the problem. It might be something that existed nearby that either will or could affect your property. And just because the phase one has a wreck, like Brian said, doesn't mean that it is contaminated. But that's why you do a phase two and why you go through the full due diligence program, so that you do collect enough information prior to purchasing the property to be able to protect yourself.
Yep. So beyond the phase one, of the report itself that identifies the wrecks, we really try to identify other things that are important as well. The business environmental risks. You may have fill material beneath the property that is not contaminated, but it's still a business environmental risk because it's going to take additional disposal measures to get rid of. So we really try to make people aware that our report may not have identified exactly how many tanks are out there, but if you're planning on digging, plan on encountering some, because we just encounter them more often than not. Properties were redeveloped. I've got a question about gas stations versus dry cleaners. Jen, do you have an opinion as to whether it's more expensive to clean up a dry cleaner versus a gas station?
Unless it's the ConocoPhillips station at Westlake-Mercer, I would say a dry cleaner is more expensive. That Westlake-Mercer property was special.
And they had a question about, you mentioned daughter products of solvents. What are the daughter products of solvents or of dry cleaners?
Oh, right. So the parent products are the original products that are in use, like PCE, tetrachloroethylene. The daughter products are the products that that chemical breaks down into. So that's going to be TCE, cis-1,2-DCE, vinyl chloride, several other chemicals, some of which are actually nastier than PCE. And PCE is pretty nasty by itself.
And Travis, we've got CKD, the slide you showed was of the Duwamish, and it's my understanding most of the CKD is generally located in that vicinity. Is CKD easy to identify in the field? And then does all CKD contain high concentrations of metals?
Certainly. Yes, CKD is typically very easy to identify in the field. It's kind of a white, powdery material typically, or kind of an ashy look to it. It's definitely clearly visibly different from the typical soils we find in the Seattle area specifically. As far as contaminants, not necessarily. The contaminants are typically caused by contaminants that were included in the actual burning process. So as I mentioned, cement kiln dust is a kind of a byproduct of the cement firing process. Inside these giant kilns, they fill it with clinker material to help construct the cement. The cement is then removed, and then the remaining ash is separated and used as the fill material. So depending on what the fuel for the fire was, or what material may be present in the clinker, that may have then transferred onto the dust. Metals are typically found. Those are typically some of the main things that are used in that clinker material, as well as other contaminants such as the PCBs. But the cement kiln dust itself isn't necessarily impacted, but those are just some of the common types of impacts that are generally associated with it.
And I'll add the most notorious source of contamination in the CKD is when the clinker originated from material at the SODO plant. That tends to be when you get the highest concentrations of SODO. The good news about CKD is you don't always have to do a subsurface investigation to identify whether it is present at a property. Our historical review will look at the aerial photos, and frequently when we review aerial photos, we can see areas of white on the property, and those areas of bright white tend to be CKD, and so we got a good idea of where to go look for it if we suspect its presence. Okay, well, I think that is all the questions that are popping up. We've got anybody has any more of them, we've got the chat button and there's another questions button. And if you hadn't seen that, you're welcome to use it. But if we're not seeing any more questions coming in the door, then I thank Jen and Travis for your help in putting this presentation together. Really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it, and we will look forward to the next soundbite that should be coming up. We have a few other topics that we're considering, including the new updates to the Phase 1 standard. And what is our other topic? Either of you remember the other topic for the webinar?
The next topic is the COVID-19 topic, protecting our employees during the COVID-19 pandemic. But yeah, I think maybe we'll be looking at Phase 1s in January.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you again, hopefully in person soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.